Public-private partnerships are everywhere around our college and university campuses these days, and yet most of us are either unaware of them or view them with skepticism or concern. But given the realities of higher ed funding, the capacity of institutions to provide certain services, successfully run programs, and the perceived disconnect between what happens on campus and what employers need, these types of collaborations have undoubtedly gained in importance over the years. Hi, I'm Tim Jansa, a leadership and organizational development coach and your host for Coaching in Higher Education, the go-to podcast for coaching professionals and those interested in coaching at colleges and universities. In this and future episodes, we'll unpack what public-private partnerships are, why universities are turning to them, and how coaching and thoughtful change leadership can help campuses navigate the opportunities and tensions they create. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Rick Rattray to the show. Rick has an extensive professional background spanning business development, consulting, and leadership in both higher education and the private sector. These days, Rick runs Parliament Group, an advisory and consulting firm focused on higher education, while he also maintains his own coaching practice. So welcome to the podcast, Rick, and thank you so much for taking time to have this conversation.
Tim, thanks so much for having me.
So to be honest, the idea of public-private partnerships between universities and industry is not something that I have often thought about, and I can imagine that it doesn't exactly come to mind naturally to many faculty and staff in higher ed. Would you mind giving us a little overview of what these partnerships are, why they're important, and what they could look like?
At their most basic, public-private partnerships are really designed to fill a gap that maybe the university does or has internally. And we see them popping up all over the place. But they typically are private sector partners that are bringing capital, they're bringing specific know-how, maybe in an area that the university has a gap, and they're bringing maybe access to markets that the university doesn't have. And it can be any combination of those things, and maybe operational expertise. Some examples of private-public partnerships that you'd be familiar with. So food service on many campuses is outsourced. It's a public-private partnership, and that works really well for most campuses. It's not a core competency of the institution. It is a core competency of the private partner. And they can bring a lot of expertise and scale to do the thing that they do that universities themselves can't do. And that scale, that capital, those things really pop up across all public-private partnership models. Others are sort of building buildings and then kind of leasing them back to the institution where the institution's capital raising isn't then tied up. There's a private partner that is willing to sort of take upfront risk, make that investment, and then in exchange get a long-term revenue stream from, say, the dormitory that's being built. And then the ones that I'm most familiar with, the online program managers or the pathway partnerships that and in both of those cases, they emerged, and certainly the market has shifted in some respects in terms of what are core competencies inside the universities and what were core competencies when some of these partnerships were evolved. But where the concept really is that the institution has a gap in either ability to recruit specific students or build specific kinds of programs or design them to be really well suited to the particular market they're trying to reach or the competitive environment that they're trying to get into or are going to get into. And in all those ways, public-private partnerships can be helpful.
You know, it's interesting. What I'm hearing you say is there are almost two categories, right? There are the ones that are more operational, that fills in operational gaps, like, for example, dorms. You talked about, residence life. Food services is one. But then there are also more programmatic and more on the academic side. And thinking about academic public-private partnerships, my mind immediately goes to the way faculty might respond to that, how they might be extremely skeptical. Is that something that you have found in your work as well?
Oh my, yes, indeed. So, and it's certainly understandable that you get into a place where you're launching a program that has that essentially is an academic program. And ultimately, in every public-private partnership that I'm familiar with, the academic institution was intended to be sort of the lead on that. That was their expertise. There was no desire to encroach on that. There was, however, there could be some really interesting feedback into that process. So, for example, in early days of online program management, we'd sit down with faculty who had been taught their course for years, decades. They knew exactly how to teach it in a classroom setting, and they were now going out into an online setting. And so leveraging Bloom's taxonomy and thinking about the way the course had to be designed was kind of new territory for some of these faculty members. And in an area where they would frequently tell us, I learned so much about my own course in the process of just having to unpack it. So clearly there are academic resistance points where you start to get into issues of IP protection and things like that. And that can be really, really sensitive. We had an entire project fail at one point based on a faculty member that felt they were really, really, really concerned about their IP. The irony in part was that they taught accounting, and accounting has generally accepted practices. So the kind of public domain stuff. But in any event, I'm sure some of your listeners may be hearing, no, actually, there's a lot of IP there. So in any event, that actually upended a program that really had a lot of potential for the institution.
You know what's fascinating about this case study is that, like with so many change initiatives, all it takes sometimes is one person, and the whole thing falls apart. So it's so important that you know who your key stakeholders are and that you bring them on board. And with faculty in particular, identity always comes up. And it's so typical that you have faculty whose identity is so built around their specific subject matter expertise and also the way they have been doing certain things, whether it actually constitutes real IP or not. So I can see how that can be really tricky. So talking about identity, I could also see how sometimes the business objectives of these partnerships really clash with more of the mission-driven objectives that faculty may embrace or people in and around the classroom may embrace. Can you speak to that?
Well, yeah. So I think that certainly is a huge area of misunderstanding between the partnerships. And I've never met anyone that wanted to get into public-private partnerships for the short-term benefit that private partners are often accused of. There's a lot of investment that goes into it, and there's a long time frame before that revenue is returned. So there's a tremendous amount of risk that the private partner takes. So it's not a quick buck that they're aiming for. They're aiming for a sustainable program, certainly one that rewards their stakeholders and sort of the financial risks that they're taking. But they're doing it to create a program that really is meaningful in the market. So there are places where there really need to be very clear guardrails in terms of academic quality or delivery or the really mission-driven things that universities are about. A lot of the contention I see is really areas that aren't that. Things like the private partner coming to them and saying, if you want international students, we really need to get quicker responses because in sort of an average institution in New Zealand responds in 2 days. In Australia, it's 3 days, and we're taking 22 days on average to respond. So we need to speed that up. It's possible. Certainly, we've resolved a lot of these issues with institutions in the past, but there are institutions that are sort of, that's just not what we do. And it feels like it's a tension between the mission and culture of the two organizations. And really, they're both aiming for a better student experience. And that change that's being requested by the private partner is just resisted by the institution because it's harder, it's difficult, and maybe because they don't have adequate resources to do what they're being asked to do.
Well, you're touching on, I think, a very important thing, and that is culture. And the tricky thing about higher ed is that there isn't just one culture. Of course, there's the culture that's on the website, however it's expressed in their mission and value statement, whatever, but then the actually espoused cultures, and those can differ very much from college to college or from unit to unit. So where does coaching fit into all this? Now that we've kind of created the general understanding and a baseline, you mentioned two areas where you have intimate familiarity, and that's the pathway partnerships and then online programs, the OPMs. Maybe those could be some examples of where you can explain a little bit and dig a little bit deeper into the role of coaching in these partnerships.
Sure. Well, certainly, as we've discussed, there are two very different cultures kind of merging, and sort of and they need to collaborate well, and you want to create as much clarity in that collaboration as possible. So communication and facilitated communication consistently is one area coaches can play a really important role, especially coming in independently and being able to have a foot in either camp, essentially be an independent broker. So communication is key. Communication really throughout the organization, building trust throughout the organization, addressing and kind of being able to unpack concerns as they emerge and resolving them in a positive and productive way to the benefit of both parties. So that's an area where the inability to do that can really, really undermine a partnership. Sometimes you end up with a messy compromise, and it really isn't helping anybody. It may push the problem away for the time being, but it creates either a program that is now not marketable or one that is untenable from the institution's perspective for some key way. And so somebody who's empowered to work through those issues to get to a truly mutually beneficial outcome, it was one area where coaching can be really valuable.
Please pardon the interruption. This is your friendly reminder that if you're enjoying today's episode, to please click like and to subscribe to the podcast. Your support is really important to us. Also, please check out the companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. Thanks so much. And now back to the episode. So you already mentioned communication and trust that are not always given on every campus. Where we talked a little bit about the cultural thing. I think there's some campuses and units on these campuses where there's a lot of psychological safety, where people feel comfortable speaking up if they find that maybe something doesn't work for them. But a lot of what higher ed is still suffering from is a lot of top-down command and control, especially when something like bringing in an external partner is concerned, where there's often a lot of money involved. Even though you said that the risk a lot of times is on the partner side, what red flags have you experienced where you can now say in retrospect that maybe this should have told us from the get-go that these partnerships weren't going to work?
Well, when the faculty senate is hearing about it after the deal is inked, that's usually a problem. There's bound to be sort of turmoil, and often that can be stifled for a period or put to rest for the time being. But to the degree, at least in the partnerships that I've done, where faculty are needed throughout the process, it's not food services. It's something the faculty are intimately involved in and are going to need to be collaborating positively with and not unhappy really out of the gate. So that's one area, is creating the right frame where communication is happening, where there's an opportunity to really understand what are the pressures driving the institution to even consider this, and having it out. We once sat in an Australian university, sat in a room filled with like 150 academics at the institution and just answered all their questions long before the partnership was signed. And there were no further major issues that popped up because we were there. We were sort of able to talk through the issues as they arose. And while maybe not everybody left that room super happy, they certainly felt like their concerns were being heard and taken seriously, and that on balance, the decision felt like the best one for the institution.
So really, it's a question of transparency.
I think so.
And asking the question, I think for good change leadership, it's always like, who is not in the room, who needs to be in the room, whose voices are not being heard? Because I think a lot of times what we're having in higher ed, and I mentioned this a minute ago, is that decisions are made here to implement something. But then the people who actually are tasked with the implementation, where the proverbial, rubber meets the road, those folks are not included. And then you mentioned this one faculty member who then decides to block everything and the whole thing falls apart. And there's a lot of money, resources, time, energy invested into this, and it just leads nowhere.
Yeah. You asked a great question, Tim, too, about the other process. And I thought I might mention also where it can fail for the private institution. Private institutions operate obviously on a much different time scale, and obviously time value of money, as we all know, and that can be a bit of a problem. So delays and interminable delays, and nobody gets involved in higher ed partnerships without an understanding that they take a while. But at universities, for a lot of good reasons, they make very cautious decisions, and they usually take a long time to do them. That said, when there are unknown delays or things that really take a lot of work on the back end, that can actually undermine the partnership in a way that just tanks it completely. I've been involved in a partnership that took the institution so long to make a decision that by the time they'd actually made the decision, the private equity partner backing the deal had a change of control and it was no longer on the table. So the deal evaporated at the Board of Regents, which is the very last thing anybody wanted in that process, but part of the consequence of timing. There's sort of also getting an understanding of the different timescales for the different partners and what they mean to the other party.
Well, and there's always this very decentralized and sometimes nebulous and ambiguous decision-making. That's just one thing that some of my coaching clients are struggling with as well, especially when they come either from industry or from government and don't have a strong higher ed background. And all of a sudden they have to navigate this world that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes they're just complaining. It's like, why do I need 16 signatures on a simple requisition? Or I don't really know who makes the final decision here. So it's one of these things when you have a private partner, especially those who are used to, once a decision is made, the implementation happens relatively quickly. And I guess there's a lot of frustration. So to kind of build up a set of expectations that are manageable and reasonable, I guess could be also one of those factors.
Yeah, 100%.
So how have you as a coach, used your coaching skills in this kind of work?
So all the issues we've talked about so far frequently have been in situations where the communication wasn't as thorough as, sort of you would ideally like to have seen. And so you land on campus and there's a fair amount of catch up that needs to be played. And, and kind of putting a coaching hat on and working that through with the various parties, meeting with everybody that maybe wasn't included to your earlier point, and just catching them up and explaining the rationale and so on. It's, again, not the ideal timing. You're already a little bit behind the eight ball, but it is certainly better than not doing that at all. And so it's certainly possible, if that ship has sailed in terms of communicating before the fact, to get in after the fact and spend time really explaining it, listening and hearing people out, and thinking about how that can shape the way the partnership evolves from there.
So it's really assessing readiness for this particular intervention, program, initiative, partnership, which I think really resonates with anybody who coaches, who starts an engagement with an assessment, for example, a 360. How does this particular engagement, this particular project, program that we're working on actually fit into the bigger picture? Are the people who need to be in the room, as I mentioned earlier, are they there? Have they been asked? Have they been brought in? Do we actually have a holistic understanding of the environment that we're going into, right?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, too, that getting clear about the expectations of all parties going into the engagement are really, really key, because there are those that pop up later, that things that you discover were disconnects that you ideally want to surface early and be able to handle.
What specific approaches or questions even, or way of questioning have worked for you or may work better than others in supporting these kind of partnerships?
That's a great question. I may let me hazard an answer, and then you can let me know if I've got this. So one approach certainly has been to understand as you just described, sort of understanding the issues around the table, and then identifying and creating cohorts, groups of folks that are responsible for various aspects of this, and creating empowerment for that group to sort of be able to speak and understand their issues and get them reflected, and then shape the course of things. We talked about communication, and that just creating, kind of clarity, shared understanding is really helpful, and spending time doing that usually takes more time than anybody's really budgeted to make sure that everybody really adequately understands. So those are some of the things that I've found to be really valuable in navigating these and then kind of coaching through them.
Well, what you're saying kind of reminds me of this old saying: if you want to chop down the tree, you're going to be spending 95% of the time sharpening the blade, because you want to make sure that you've covered all your bases. You've brought everybody on. You've heard all the different voices before you actually start this initiative.
Yeah.
So other than that, any other strategies that you, as a coach and a consultant, and maybe we can dig into that in a second, are particularly useful, if there's even such a thing as making a blanket statement about this?
We talked a little bit about the sort of expectation setting and understanding that. And I think the areas that we've also talked about are the places where these tend to fail. So in my example earlier, for example, the student time frame, the sort of turnaround time for students, really being able to sort of navigate why those barriers exist, what's necessary. There's sort of advocacy questions, which can be coaching in a sense, because the head of international just has not had a lot of success getting additional resources from the finance team or senior administration, and helping navigate that process to put together a better story, or help them put together a better story, can be a coaching exercise in navigating how do we tell the story in a way that, because there is alignment here, there are places where both parties really want success. So how do we get to alignment and create the right story that gets the resources that are needed?
So really developing the compelling why, which really is at the center of any skilled and successful leadership initiative, because you want to make sure that everybody understands, like, why are we doing this? Why are we not doing this in-house? Because one of the challenges I found is that there is a lot of capacity and knowledge and skills on campus, and the people at the same time who have developed this expertise are often not brought in or not consulted,
yes,
which could cause a major conflict, and they feel excluded, and they're sometimes actively almost sabotaging certain change initiatives. Is that something that you found to happen?
100%. I at one point went through this exercise of describing for institutions that were considering launching, sort of international programs, or the pathway programs that were so common not that long ago, what an outside partner really brought to the table. And one thing that the outside partner brought to the table was just raising the level of conversation. So suddenly all that expertise that existed somewhere in your institution that wasn't getting heard, wasn't getting essentially their day in court. Obviously, there's a way to sort of navigate that to make those people feel part of the effort. But certainly just dynamic of connecting the dots between the parties, that the resources that already exist in the institution and how they can be brought to bear and how they can be leveraged in this sort of new world, and really where the third party partner might be looked at positively. I guess I would say that private partner is creating attention and awareness for an expertise that already exists inside the institution. And to your point, sort of thinking about that as part of your sharpening the axe, exercise of who needs to be involved. Where do we have expertise? How does that expertise get brought in ways that feel productive to them and they don't feel like they're being completely sidelined is one way to ensure that they're on side instead of feeling very much like this is something they want to fight against.
What you're saying brings me back to what I have been saying for a little while, and that's talking about coaches or coaching related advisory services as the competent outsider, where competence is important because you need to understand the higher ed ecosystem in order to render optimal service, because you're kind of helping these institutions and also the third-party provider to cut through a lot of the misunderstandings and the assumptions that underlie and sometimes block and muck up this partnership. Again, especially if not everybody's brought in, and then to connect the dots also at a higher level to lead to this compelling why. So I think this is a great example. I wanted to ask you something that has to deal with the two sides of the same coin. It's consulting and it's coaching, because what we're talking about seems to be mixing both of them up. Is there, in your mind, a clear delineation between coaching in the public-private partnership space and consulting, or does one lead into the other, or what's the relationship here?
It's a great question. For me, they are somewhat blurred, and they are in that coaching techniques are highly valuable in this environment, but expertise and clarity about what the outcome should look like in order to be successful is also part of that. So there is that advisory kind of informed coach or informed outsider, as you just described, that is necessary. You do need to know where you're going. And to me, it ends up feeling blended. I'm sure someone can make a really good case about how you would separate them, but for me, it's always been a bit blended.
One thing that I have found is that a lot of times folks come in, especially when the third party comes in, and their role is more of a consultant. Maybe initially they come in, they do the assessment, they talk to the stakeholders, then they create a report and basically put out a plan or lay out a plan that their institutional client should follow. And then they step back and it's like, here, go and do your thing, which doesn't necessarily lead to success. And I have always thought that coaching comes in, or should come in really, which is often missing at that point, to support the long-term success and to kind of accompany the institution in the implementation of this plan. But again, that doesn't always help. But I can certainly see that there is definitely an overlap, right? So even in the preparation of the consulting, there is a coaching component to it where it's about listening a lot, asking questions, right?
Yeah, 100%. And that attitude of listening and paying careful attention to what's being said, really uncovering the issues behind the issues, that attitude is highly valuable in this because there's so much potential for misunderstanding. And so really being able to uncover the issues is the key skill set.
To wrap things up, Rick, what advice would you have for coaches who have the opportunity to support an institution or potentially a private partner in one of these public-private partnerships? What should they be looking out for? What works? What doesn't work? And how should they approach this particular coaching engagement?
Well, and this wasn't clear to me until just a second ago, Tim, when you phrased the question in the brilliant way that you did. That in my mind, the coach role is most effective if it's coming from the university side, because the biggest levels of understanding it's the private partner that's approaching the university. Typically, it's not the other way around. And there's a lot of mistrust on the university side, typically, that needs to be unsurfaced and addressed. And it's very, very hard to do that from the private sector side. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And so my advice, though, to someone with that opportunity is there's certainly loads of need for good coaching, for bringing out the issues that underlie and that can ultimately destroy the long-term success of the partnership. Sort of identifying as you said, expectations of the partners, really unpacking that, addressing concerns and understanding those concerns, bringing them forward and through to fruition in terms of a common ground action plan going forward. And then navigating the common ground discussions, because ultimately there are some compromises that get made and both parties need to be aware of them in ways that can feel empowering rather than you're sort of stuck with it.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, because I can see that a coach can easily land between the two camps of trying to help the private partner understand higher ed. But I think there's also the need for the higher ed institution to understand the needs of the private partner. And to have somebody who can help both sides navigate this could be tremendously beneficial.
100%.
Well, Rick, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for providing your expertise and your wisdom. As I mentioned, this is the first of several conversations where we're digging into different areas of public-private partnerships, and I really couldn't have found a better conversation partner than you to paint a larger picture, to help our audience understand how those private-public partnerships work, why they're important, and also what some of the pitfalls and some tremendous opportunities are. So thank you for that, Rick.
Tim, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And thank you to our audience for spending a little bit of time with us today. As always, if you're interested in more information on this episode, our guest, Rick Rattray, and today's topic, please visit our companion website, higheredcoaching.us or leadershipimagined.com/podcast. See you again soon. And until then, keep making a difference, one client and one conversation at a time. Take care.